Nair, 1962. London. Every major record label in Britain has rejected the Beatles. Decca Records famously says, "Guitar groups are on the way out, Mr. Epstein. The Beatles have no future in show business. They're four working-class kids from Liverpool who can barely read music. The industry tells them what all musicians hear. You perform what we tell you. You record songs our writers create. You do what you're told. Musicians are interchangeable products, not artists. The Beatles say, we'll write our own songs, control our own sound, build our own empire. The industry laughs. That's not how this works. That's not how this has ever worked. Within 5 years, the Beatles will prove that musicians don't need permission from executives, songwriters, or anyone else to create art. They'll show that a band can write their own material, experiment in the studio, evolve in public, and become the most influential cultural force of the 20th century. Before the Beatles, musicians were performers of other people's songs. After the Beatles, musicians became artists, controlling their own creative destiny. But here's the real question. How did four kids with no formal training destroy the entire power structure of the music industry? How did they prove that musicians could be taken seriously as artists, not just entertainers? How did they change music from a product manufactured by suits into an art form controlled by the artists themselves? This is that story. 1940s, 50s. The music industry has a simple structure. Professional songwriters in offices write hits. Pretty faces perform them. Producers control everything. Musicians are replaceable. This system works perfectly for the industry. They control the product. Musicians are employees, not partners. Then come four kids from Liverpool: John Lennon, Paul McCartney, George Harrison, Ringo Starr. Working class. Not formally trained, rough around the edges. But John and Paul have been writing songs together since they were teenagers. Not because anyone asked them to, because they can't help it. They meet in 1957 and immediately start creating. Here's what makes this revolutionary. In 1950s, 60s Britain, musicians don't write. Songwriters write. Performers perform. That's the system. That's how it's always been. The Beatles don't care about how it's always been. When they finally get a record deal with Parlophone in 1962, producer George Martin expects to give them songs written by professional songwriters. That's standard practice. The Beatles say, "We have our own songs." George Martin is skeptical. Four Liverpool kids think they can write better than professional songwriters. But he listens. He's impressed, not because the songs are perfect, but because they're original, fresh, different. Their first single, "Love Me Do," is a Lennon-McCartney composition. It reaches number 17 in UK charts. Modest. But it proves they can write commercially viable songs. Their second single, "Please Please Me," hits on number 1. Also written by Lennon-McCartney. Suddenly, something unprecedented is happening. A band is succeeding with their own material. Other acts notice. If the Beatles can write their own songs, why can't we? The power dynamic starts shifting. But the Beatles don't stop at writing. They start demanding creative control over their recordings. They want to experiment, try new sounds, break rules. George Martin becomes their collaborator, not just their producer. He has classical training. They have raw creativity. Together, they start treating the recording studio as an instrument itself. Rubber Soul is released. It's not just a collection of singles. It's a cohesive album. Every song flows into the next. It's art, not just commercial product. Critics who dismiss the Beatles as teenage fluff start paying attention. This is sophisticated. This is serious. These aren't just lucky kids. These are artists. Bob Dylan meets the Beatles in 1964. He asks them, "Don't you write songs about anything?" He's challenging them to go deeper. Write about real things, not just, "Yeah, yeah, yeah." The Beatles listen. They evolve. "Help," is John crying for help. "Yesterday" is Paul writing about loss. The lyrics get deeper, more personal, more meaningful. They're not just writing about holding hands anymore. They're writing about life, pain, consciousness, existence. The Beatles stop touring. Why? Because screaming fans drown out the music. They can't hear themselves play. They're not making music anymore. They're just standing there while girls scream. This decision shocks the industry. Touring is how musicians make money. Touring is how you stay relevant. Stopping at the peak of fame is insane. But the Beatles understand something. If they can't create the music they want to create, what's the point? They're not going to be like Elvis, trapped in a formula, playing Vegas shows when they're old. They retreat to the studio. And this is where everything changes. 1967, Abbey Road Studios, London. The Beatles have unlimited time, unlimited budget, and George Martin willing to try anything. They're not just recording songs anymore. They're building sonic landscapes, using the studio technology in ways nobody has before. They record instruments backward. They splice different takes together at different speeds. They use orchestras in rock music. They experiment with feedback, distortion, sound effects. Strawberry Fields Forever features multiple versions at different tempos, somehow merged into one seamless song. John's voice sounds like it's coming from another dimension. It's psychedelic before psychedelic is even a term most people know. June 1st, 1967. Sgt. Pepper's Lonely Hearts Club Band is released. It changes music forever. This isn't a collection of singles. It's a concept album, a complete artistic statement. The songs flow together. The album cover is art. The Beatles in colorful military uniforms surrounded by dozens of cultural icons. It costs more than any album cover in history. The music is insane. Orchestra crescendos in A Day in the Life. Sitars in Within You Without You. Circus sounds in Being for the Benefit of Mr. Kite. Lyrics about LSD, aging everyday life elevated to poetry. The Times of London calls it a decisive moment in the history of Western civilization. Not music history, human civilization. Sgt. Pepper legitimizes rock music as art. Before this, rock is entertainment for teenagers. After this, rock is taken seriously by intellectuals, academics, cultural critics. The album proves that popular music can be analyzed, discussed, studied like literature or classical music, that commercial success and artistic credibility can coexist. But the Beatles aren't done. August 1967. Their manager, Brian Epstein, dies of an overdose. The Beatles lose their anchor, their business mind, their connection to the practical world. They decide to manage themselves. They start Applecore, a multimedia company. The idea, creative freedom for artists without corporate control. It's naive. It mostly fails financially. But the intention is revolutionary. Artists controlling the means of production, creating their own system rather than working within the industry system. The Beatles travel to India to study meditation with Maharishi Mahesh Yogi. This is insane by industry standards. You're the biggest band in the world. You don't take months off to meditate in India. But the Beatles don't care about industry standards. They're seeking meaning beyond fame. They're introducing transcendental meditation and Eastern philosophy to millions of Western kids. Suddenly, yoga and meditation aren't weird foreign practices. They're cool because the Beatles do them. While in India, they write dozens of songs. They return and record the White Album, 30 tracks, every genre imaginable, hard rock, ballads, avant-garde sound collages, country blues. It's deliberately all over the place. They're showing their range, proving they can do anything. But cracks are forming. Paul wants to work constantly. John is falling in love with Yoko Ono and becoming more experimental. George is tired of being the quiet Beatle and wants more songs on albums. Ringo briefly quits during White Album sessions. They're growing apart, but they still have magic. January 1969. The Get Back sessions. The idea, strip away studio tricks and just play rock and roll like they used to. It's a disaster. They argue constantly. The footage shows 4 people who don't want to be in the same room, but then something beautiful happens. January 30th, 1969. They set up on the roof of Apple headquarters in London and play an unannounced concert. Their first live performance in 3 years. They play for 42 minutes until police shut them down. Office workers pour into streets, traffic stops, everyone looking up at 4 guys on a roof playing rock and roll. It's spontaneous, joyful, pure. Their final live performance, a perfect ending. Except it's not the end. They have one more album, summer 1969. They record Abbey Road. They know it's probably their last album together. They pour everything into it. Side 2 is a 16-minute medley of songs flowing into each other. Classical music structure applied to rock. Paul's The End contains the lyric, "And in the end, the love you take is equal to the love you make." Their final statement. After all the experimentation, all the pushing boundaries, they end with simple truth about love. April 10th, 1970. Paul announces he's leaving the Beatles. The most successful band in history breaks up at their peak. The Beatles broke up in 1970, but the revolution they started never stopped. First and most fundamentally, the Beatles proved musicians could write their own material and succeed commercially. Before the Beatles, this seemed impossible. After the Beatles, it became standard. Every band that writes their own songs exists in a world the Beatles created. They destroyed the system where songwriters and performers were separate. They proved that musicians could be both. Second, the Beatles showed that musicians could evolve in public. Each album was different from the last. They never repeated themselves. They constantly experimented. This seems normal now, but before the Beatles, musicians found a formula and repeated it forever. The Beatles proved that growth and experimentation could be commercially successful. Third, the Beatles legitimized the album as artistic statement. Before Sgt. Pepper, albums were collections of singles plus filler. After Sgt. Pepper, albums became art. Every concept album, every album designed to be heard as complete work, exists because the Beatles proved it could work commercially and artistically. Fourth, the Beatles changed how recordings are made. They pioneered studio techniques, automatic double tracking, vari-speed recording, direct input recording, reverse tape effects. Modern recording owes massive debt to what the Beatles and George Martin developed. They treated the studio as an instrument, not just a place to capture performance. Fifth, the Beatles proved that commercial success and artistic credibility could coexist. Before them, artists had to choose: make money playing safe or create art and stay poor. The Beatles sold hundreds of millions of records while constantly experimenting and pushing boundaries. They proved that audiences would follow artists into new territory if the work was good enough. Sixth, the Beatles changed youth culture globally. They made long hair on men acceptable. They influenced fashion, collarless suits, Cuban boots, psychedelic patterns. More importantly, they made questioning authority cool, made Eastern philosophy accessible, made introspection and consciousness expansion mainstream. Seventh, the Beatles influenced every genre that followed: rock, pop, punk, hip-hop, electronic. All studied the Beatles. Their melodies, their structures, their harmonies became foundational. Radiohead, Oasis, Kanye West, countless artists across all genres cite the Beatles as primary influence. Eighth, the Beatles changed music videos and visual presentation. Their films A Hard Day's Night and Help pioneered the music video aesthetic decades before MTV. Every music video owes debt to the Beatles' visual innovation. Ninth, the Beatles proved that working-class kids without formal training could become the most influential artists of their generation. This democratization of art, the idea that you don't need credentials or permission from institutions to create meaningful work, that's revolutionary. 10th, the Beatles' breakup proved that artists could walk away at the peak. They didn't need to milk success until it died. They could end on their terms, preserving artistic integrity. 11th, the Beatles showed that band dynamics, creative tensions, and personal growth were as important as the music. They made the process of creation as interesting as the product. Every music documentary, every making of special, every behind-the-scenes content exists because the Beatles made the creative process fascinating. 12th, the Beatles' individual post-breakup careers proved their talent was real. John's Imagine became one of the most important songs ever written. Paul became the most successful recording artist in history. George's My Sweet Lord was massive. Ringo had multiple hits. They succeeded individually because their collaborative magic was real talent, not luck or hype. Yesterday is the most covered song in history. Over 2,200 versions. It's been played 7 million times on US radio alone. The Beatles are the best-selling band in history, over 600 million records sold. But the numbers don't capture the real impact. The Beatles changed what it means to be a musician. Before them, musicians were performers taking orders. After them, musicians were artists controlling their destiny. They proved you could write your own songs, experiment constantly, evolve publicly, and become the most successful and influential artist in the world. Every musician who controls their creative vision, who writes their own material, who experiments without asking permission, who treats albums as artistic statements, they're working in the world the Beatles created. So how did the Beatles change the world? They destroyed the music industry's power structure by proving musicians could write their own songs and succeed commercially without professional songwriters. They legitimized rock music as art worthy of serious analysis, not just teenage entertainment. They pioneered studio recording techniques that are still used today and treated the recording studio as an instrument. They proved that albums could be cohesive artistic statements, not just collections of singles. They showed that commercial success and artistic experimentation could coexist, that audiences would follow artists who constantly evolved. Most importantly, the Beatles proved that musicians didn't need permission from anyone to control their creative destiny, that four working-class kids without formal training could become the most influential artists of the 20th century by refusing to accept the industry's rules. They didn't just make music. They changed what music could be, what musicians could do, and who had the power to decide. Every band that writes their own songs, every artist who experiments without asking permission, every musician who treats their work as art, they're living in the world the Beatles created. That's how four kids from Liverpool changed everything forever.